Hello, everyone, and good evening. We're super excited to present the first in our learning series for our summer Tacoma capacity building project. And this is called Understanding the Basics. What is a grant? Ariana Garofalo, our senior grant and RFP writer, is going to share all her insider knowledge on what she knows about grants and grant seeking. So welcome to our presentation. Thank you. Ariana.
Okay, so in this presentation today, we're going to cover three things. We're going to cover grants versus other funding types, the different types of grants that are available, and then also some advice for navigating the world of grants. So first, let's talk about grants versus other funding types. So I want to start by just giving a definition of what is a grant. So I've got two definitions here that we can talk through. So the first definition that I want us to think about is thinking of a grant as an opportunity. A grant is an opportunity for your organization to advance your mission by securing financial support from various funders. Definition two is that a grant is non-repayable funds distributed by grant makers to help you achieve your goals. So both definitions are accurate. Definition one, I like thinking about a grant as an opportunity. And also with the second definition, it's important to keep in mind that yes, grants are non-repayable, the closest thing that you can get to free money. And so we're going to go over a little bit later on some more about what grants are exactly, but I wanted to start with these two definitions. So to go along with the definition and the idea of a grant as an opportunity, I want to get us excited about grants. So as you know, your organization does great work, and there is always a need for more work to be done and for more money. You know, no matter what's going on in the government, no matter how much funding there is or is not, there's always a great need for funding for your organization. And so grants can be a great way to help you close that gap and find the funding that your organization needs to do the awesome work that you're doing. So these numbers are all from 2022. So $105 billion was given away by foundations in 2022. 29.48 billion was given by corporate foundations in 2022, and then just over $1 trillion was given away by the US government. And so I give these numbers to help you get excited about grants. And they are a lot of work, and there is a lot to learn and a lot of processes to go through in order to get these grants. And they're not guaranteed. They are competitive processes. But I just want to help you get excited and thinking about the fact that there are lots of these opportunities out there for you to get funding for the important work that your organization is doing. So let's talk first about how a grant differs from a loan. So we're going to go through a couple of different sources of funding in this presentation. Probably the most easily confusable one to a grant is a loan. And so let's just compare these two things side by side. So most people are familiar with the idea of loans and may think that grants are similar, but they actually are quite different. So a grant does not need to be repaid. As I mentioned, they're non-repayable funds, whereas loans do require repayment. Grants don't have any interest or fees, whereas loans do have fees and interests. Grants are going to require a competitive application process, whereas loans are going to have a more qualification-based application process. So grants are going to come from a variety of funders, including the government or perhaps private charitable foundations, whereas loans are going to come from a bank or an organization such as the US Small Business Administration. Okay, so let's think about some other different types of funding that grants may be different from. So grants are different from donations. So the donation would typically be awarded through an application process. They may be voluntary contributions that are made. Again, there's no expectation of repayment, but it is a different process and is freely given rather than given through through a process. There are also investments. Investments would be getting something in return. So, purchasing an asset or a product with the expectation of generating income or profit. So those are quite different from a grant. Other forms may be sponsorships, and some of these may also be ways to diversify your funding. And you could use some of these other funding sources in addition to grants. So sponsorships would be in-kind support that are given by businesses, perhaps to promote their business or other benefits. And sponsorships are different from grants in that they involve a mutually beneficial relationship where the sponsorship gets recognition for their support. Now, some grants will request that you acknowledge the funder, but not always. There are also contracts. Contracts you may also get in a similar way to grants. There may be a competitive application process, but they are a different process. So a contract is a legally binding agreement between two or more parties. Contracts are probably going to be awarded based on merit or need, and usually there's also a competitive process of bidding or negotiation. So now we're going to talk about the different types of grant funders now that we've gotten a really solid foundation of understanding what a grant is. So again, the two big things to recap, to remember, is that a grant is non-repayable. It's money that you are given and you don't need to pay back. And a grant is also an opportunity to advance the mission of your business or your nonprofit or whatever organization it is that you need funding for. So for the types of grant funders that you may encounter, there's really two main buckets. So the first bucket is going to be philanthropic grant funders, and then the other bucket is going to be government. And so we're going to go through each of these in a bit more detail, but this just gives you an overview. So for philanthropic funders, there are different types of foundations, which may be private, corporate, or community-based. There are nonprofit organizations, and then also some tribal, Native American tribal funders. And then government, of course, can either be state or federal. There may also be funds available from county governments or other local government agencies, but state and federal are going to be the ones that you see the most commonly. So we'll do a little rundown to get into a bit more detail about the different types of the philanthropic grant funders. So one thing to keep in mind is that when you are thinking about grants, so as we've noted, there's a lot of funding for grants available, but you are not going to want to apply for every grant that's available because they're not all going to be a good fit for you. And this is something that we'll go over more in future training sessions. If you want to attend, we'll be having another session about grant prospecting where we'll talk about this more. But to give you just a brief overview, you're going to want to make sure that the grant that you're applying for has good alignment with your organization and your mission. So when you're looking at private foundations, so some local private foundations that you have likely heard of would be like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Baker Foundation. These are typically funded by an individual or a family. They have specific areas of interest and often a specific geographic focus as well. Corporate foundations are going to be things like Costco, Walmart, Chick-fil-A, any corporation that you can think of, many of them do have a grant making program. So that can be something to look into if you're thinking about where to find grants from. These foundations may focus their giving on areas that are related to their business interests or their corporate values. So again, this is a great time to think about what your organization does and how you can line that up with the mission and values of who you're applying for funding from. And I also want you to think about this piece of geographic focus. Some corporations may only give grants out to areas where they have maybe their headquarters or perhaps locations or a large employee base. So you also always want to think about the geographic area of a funder as well. There are also the community foundations and nonprofit organizations that may offer money as well. These can support a wide range of initiatives and causes. Tribal grants are something else to think about, particularly for those of you here in Washington State. As you know, there are many tribes in the area, such as Nisqually, Muckleshoot, and many more. Many of these tribes do have grant-making programs. Some of them may have requirements that are specific to their particular tribe, for example, serving members of their tribe or somehow being related. But in many cases, they just want to help the community and help better the community that they're part of. So these are often going to have geographic restrictions based on the areas where the tribe is based. But these are another type of philanthropic funding. And so with all of these different kinds of funders, there's going to be a wide range of the amount of funding that is available. Typically, tribal grants might be smaller, perhaps in the $5,000 to $10,000 range. Corporate foundation grants are typically smaller as well. Private foundations can vary greatly. They may be smaller grants or they may be much larger. So again, it varies grant by grant. The government grant funding, so government grant funding typically comes from taxpayer dollars. It comes through different initiatives and is administered by various government agencies. So the state funding level, something you may hear about locally, the Washington Department of Commerce is a big funder here. And for federal funding, these grants could come from any department, the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Administration, any of these types of funding. Federal funding is often governed by really specific federal laws, regulations, and guidelines. And these grants can support a wide variety of programs and initiatives. They're typically larger in scale than any of the other types of grants that we've talked about, but they're also more complex, both to apply for and also to then report on after the grant. So now that we've given you a bit of an overview about what a grant is and the different types of funders that you might be able to expect to get grants from, we're now going to share some tips with you for navigating the grant world, which can be quite overwhelming when you're new to it because it is quite different. As we've talked about, grants are different from loans, they're different from donations, they're different from all other types of funding. And so they really are their own world that can be a lot to learn how to navigate. So we've tried to break this down into just a few of the most helpful tips to really just give you an overview. And again, we're going to get into a lot of this stuff in more detail in other training workshops that we'll be offering. But we just want to give an overview here of some tips just to kind of keep in the back of your head as you're beginning to navigate this world and thinking about the unique requirements of it. So the first thing that I want to share is that you should expect to apply for a lot of grants. There's an organization called the Grant Professionals Association that does a really great annual survey of people who are in the grant profession. And so this is really helpful because this is real data based on folks who are applying for grants all of the time. And so they surveyed a total of 4,000 grant professionals. What they found is that 90% of organizations that submitted 3 to 5 grant applications won at least one. 98% of organizations that submitted 6 to 11 grants won at least one. And 99 to 100% of organizations that submitted more than 11 grants got at least one. So as you're looking at these numbers, keep in mind that, the more grants you apply for, the higher your chances of success. It seems to take about 3 to 5 grant applications submitted to get a pretty good chance of getting one. And again, that's never going to be a guarantee. These are general numbers, but I lead with this because I just want to convey this idea that, grants are a lot of work, and you really need to apply for lots of them. Sometimes you can find a really great alignment, find a funder that's just perfect, and get lucky to get just one grant that you apply for. But in general, this is something that you're going to be needing to do a lot of. And so as we go through these tips, I'm going to give you some ideas about things you can do to help yourself prepare. And something else that's good to keep in mind is that the more grants you do, the easier it becomes. So usually the first couple that you do, you're going to feel like, geez, this is really a lot of work. But as you go along, it is going to become easier, because once you start gathering data, gathering information, gathering your materials, it's going to be a lot easier to get these grants out the door. And you won't have to write completely new text for each grant that you submit. You can recycle. Oftentimes you'll be writing a grant for something similar to a previous grant that you've written, and so you can start recycling your own text, and you'll probably need to write some new things, but it does get easier. So don't get discouraged. It is harder at the beginning, but it does get easier the more that you do. So the second big picture tip that I want to give is to just have you always keep in the back of your mind that grants are really specific and really unique. So no two grants are ever going to be exactly the same. So when you're looking at a grant, each one you need to look at with fresh eyes. Just because you've done one doesn't mean that you know exactly what to do with the next one, because they are all so unique. Even different grants from the same funder may have different requirements. For example, the Washington Department of Commerce, often they have some standard elements, but each grant switches things up a little bit. So it's really just important to put on your best eyeglasses for looking at details, and just really examining things with a fine-tooth comb. So the variations from grant to grant, they're each going to have unique instructions and guidelines. Some examples that you want to look out for are word or character limits, page limits. So these can be tricky. You may have written one grant that the funder required 1,000 words, but then you look at another grant and it's a similar topic, but you have to reduce it to 250 words. And the unfortunate part is that if you fall outside of these instructions, or you don't quite follow the guidelines, your application may actually be disqualified before the funder even reads through all of it. So it is unfortunate, but one of the best things you can do to set yourself up for success is to make sure that you're following the guidelines really specifically. So other different requirements might be formatting, such as the font or the type. And these seem like silly little things, but they actually are important and do matter in the overall chances of your grant application being successful. There's going to be a variety of different ways that you might submit a grant. So sometimes you may email it to a specific contact or email address. Other times there may be a grant portal that you have to create a login and set up with your organization's information. And still other times you might actually have to go to the post office and put it in an envelope and mail it that way. So those are all possibilities for grants. You're also going to likely be required to include some attachments with your grant. So again, this is going to vary for each grant. So there may be financial reports. If you're a 501c3, your determination letter from the IRS. You may need a list of your board of directors. That may need their professional affiliations, their email addresses, different variations on that theme. You may need resumes for your staff members. And so again, this is something that can feel like a heavier paperwork burden at the beginning, but as you go on, you're going to have all of this information saved. And I would encourage you to come up with a system of organization that works for you, whether you have certain files or spaces on your computer where you save things, or whatever it is that you do just to get yourself organized and keep all of these documents that you commonly need, keep them all in one place. And that's really going to help you speed up the process as you apply for more and more. Other variations may come in the budget. Some grant funders are going to they're going to have a spreadsheet template they want you to follow. Other times they may want you to submit it as a PDF, or you may just type some numbers into a table in the application portal. So again, huge variations in that. So I offer this to you as just a big picture piece of advice of not that you can prepare right now for every grant that you're ever going to submit, but if there's one thing you can take away from this and remember is just to really remember paying attention to those guidelines and instructions to really set yourself up for success as best as possible. So another tip that I want to give is to identify the needs that your organization has. So some grants will give funding for general operating expenses. Those are called unrestricted funds. They're really great when those come around because those funds you can use for anything. You can just have them in your organization's budget and use them as you see fit. However, it's probably more common that you're going to have to request funding for a specific project. So you might need money to do some building renovations, maybe to buy some equipment, supplies, maybe to hire more staff, to seek some outside services, or any number of projects or needs that you might have. So at the outset, when you're just getting ready to start applying for grants, it's a good practice to step back and take some time to analyze and think about what your needs actually are. And this is something else that can help set you up for success in navigating this world of grants. So you want to make sure that you have your operating budget. If that's not something that you have already, that will be something that you need as you're applying for grants. You want to outline your budget by program, by service line, or project so that you can know exactly how much funding you need per project. Because say you're an organization that has multiple different things that you offer. Maybe you offer youth services and case management and after school programming. And so some grants, perhaps one grant, you're only applying for funding for youth programming. That funder may just want to know how much money are you spending on youth programming per year. And so it's really helpful if you break down your operating budget into these different service lines so that you have that information easily at a glance. Again, this is just really going to save you a lot of time as you go along. And make sure you keep your budget up to date, whether you have an accountant or a finance team or a CPA that you work with, or if you're doing this work on your own, it's always easier to keep things consistently updated rather than having to go back and figure out what you did for an entire year or a big chunk of time. And keeping things updated can help you really identify and understand the gaps and help you understand where you actually need funding. And the biggest piece of advice perhaps we can give here is just to be willing to be flexible. So even though general operating funds are a bit of a unicorn that aren't always available, you might be able to kind of shuffle your funding around a little bit, especially if you're a smaller organization and you have some room to make these shifts. So think about, if there's a certain grant for youth services, maybe you already have a lot of money allocated to that, but you don't have money for your case management. Well, what if you move some of the money from the youth services and then we're able to get the funding for case management? So think about how it's practical for your organization to be flexible in how you allocate your funding. This can really help free you up and help you be eligible for applying for a lot of different grants and to make a lot of different kinds of grants useful to you rather than having to just find one particular grant to fit one particular thing. So the more flexibility you can have, the more the grant world will open up to you and have opportunities for you to apply for. So you're also going to want to keep in mind that grants are super time sensitive. So you want to be super aware of the application deadlines. Unfortunately, if you submit something after an application deadline, it's going to be thrown out. It won't be eligible. And so you want to also make sure that you give yourself enough time to prepare a strong grant proposal. Proposal is another word for application. It's typically used in the grant world to talk about a grant proposal or grant application. They can be used interchangeably. So the amount of time that it takes to prepare your proposal is going to vary widely depending on both the type of grant and how much material you already have prepared. So like I've been mentioning throughout this presentation, the more grants you do, the easier they get. And so if you already have all of your attachments, all of your financial documents, your board of directors, all of these things prepared in advance, you're going to have a shorter time on your application. Whereas if you have to pull all of those things together, it might take a very long time because remember, the grant application is not just about writing for the questions that they ask. It's also going to be about all these other supplemental materials that they're needing. So there's really no way to say this in a hard and fast, there's no strict lines here, but these are just some kind of ballpark estimates of time. In general, grants from philanthropic funders are going to be shorter. You might find some really lovely ones that maybe only take 3 hours. Those are honestly pretty rare. Most of them are going to take probably 10 to 15, maybe even 20 hours. Again, this can vary widely, but this is something you want to think about too when you're thinking about what grants to apply for. You want to take a look at the application before you actually apply and think, is this worth my time? If the grant is only for $2,000 and you know that it's going to take you 10 hours to prepare that grant, is that a good return on your investment? Maybe not. And so these are things that you can think about as you're deciding where to spend your time and your energy. State grants are going to be on the bigger side, maybe 15 to 30 hours to get them ready. They often have more paperwork, more attachments, and just more requirements in terms of the narrative and the application you're putting together as well. Federal grants are definitely the biggest bucket of time. Those could be 30 to maybe 50 or even more hours. Again, federal grants are likely to be the largest amount of money, but that big dollar sign also comes with a lot of work. So that's another thing for you to think about. Does your organization have the capacity to put the time and the effort into that grant application? So again, those are just some ballparks of time for you to think about as you're learning how to navigate the grant world. So the final tip that we want to give is for you to be prepared to manage a grant. So as we talked about in the beginning, if you submit a handful of grants, 3 to 5, there's a 90% chance that you're going to get one, which is super exciting. However, I want you to think about the fact that you do need to be prepared to get a grant. So yes, a grant is non-repayable. It's not a loan. There's no interest. There's no fees. But the thing that there is with grants is requirements for you being held accountable for how you spent that money. So this is going to vary a lot based on the funder. Typically, the philanthropic funders might have the easiest kinds of requirements, whereas state or federal are going to be a lot larger. These are called generally reporting requirements. And so it's good to think about this from the outset, just to make sure that your organization has the resources to actually be able to manage this grant when you do receive it. So at a minimum, all funders are going to want you to track and be able to report. This is where the term reporting requirements comes into play, how you used their money. So this is another thing that you can really think about ahead of time in order to make the process a lot easier for you. So you want to just come up with a system that allows you to track things easily. So at minimum, a good system should keep your receipts and invoices organized. So anytime you make a purchase, you purchase a new computer, you purchase some new furniture or equipment with money from the grant, you've got to save that receipt. You want to be able to account for every dollar that you've spent from the grant money. And you're going to need a way, the system that you're using, whether that's QuickBooks or whatever financial system you're using to track things, you have to track the expenses for the grant and the rest of your operations separately. And so again, just having the system kind of set up ahead of time is really going to make your life a lot easier once you actually get the grant. And you also want to keep a hold of any necessary files or documents that you're going to need for reporting. One thing that you want to check into with each grant is how long do you have to retain your records afterwards? Some funders may want you to continue retaining your records for 5 years after the grant period. Others may not have that requirement. So this is another place where, just like how you went through the application with a fine-tooth comb and you looked for all the little details, like how many words can I have, how many characters, how many pages, all those little fine-tooth comb details, you want to look at the grant contract with an equally fine-tooth comb to make sure that you can manage all of these different requirements. And you want to keep all the documentation. So keep the pay stubs for your employees, keep track of how many people that you've served, keep track of the accomplishments that you've made with your grant as well, because a lot of times at the end of the grant period, you're going to be asked to submit a final report and to talk about what you were able to accomplish with that grant. So maybe you were able to provide translation services for a certain number of people, or provide childcare to a certain number of children, or whatever impact it is that you're making on the community. You want to get into the habit of tracking that. And so that will also help you get more grants in the future, because having that data helps make your grant stronger. So it's good for the reporting process as well as for the process of getting more grants in the future.